Number 1. Tyrese Devin Haspel. In July 2020, New York City police entered a luxury apartment on the Lower East Side for what they believed was a routine welfare check. They expected silence, maybe an unanswered phone call, nothing out of the ordinary. Instead, they stepped into one of the most disturbing crime scenes Manhattan had seen in years. Inside that upscale penthouse lay the body of tech entrepreneur Fahim Saleh, the 33-year-old founder known for building successful companies across multiple countries. What shocked investigators was not only the killing itself, but the methodical attempt to clean and stage the scene. Whoever did this had planned to return. Whoever did this had access, confidence, and knowledge of every detail inside the victim's private world. And that trail led straight to someone everyone thought they could trust. Fahim Saleh's rise in the tech world was rapid. He built his reputation as a self-made innovator. He founded companies in Bangladesh and Nigeria, including the ride-sharing service Gokada. His work made international headlines and earned him a reputation as someone changing entire industries. That success translated into wealth. In 2020, he lived in a $2.2 million Manhattan apartment equipped with a private elevator that opened directly into his living room. Only residents and their approved guests could access it. It was a symbol of exclusivity, privacy, and security. Working closely with him was 21-year-old Tyrese Devin Haspel. He wasn't a random employee. He was a trusted personal assistant responsible for managing day-to-day finances, transactions, and scheduling. He had access to sensitive information and full proximity to Saleh's professional and personal life. According to prosecutors, that access presented an opportunity Haspel eventually started abusing. Investigators later discovered he had stolen tens of thousands of dollars from Saleh. When confronted, Saleh didn't press charges. He offered a repayment plan, giving Haspel a chance to fix his mistakes without involving law enforcement. It was an unusually generous response for a financial betrayal, and one that prosecutors later said showed how much Saleh trusted him. On the 13th of July 2020, Saleh returned to his apartment building and stepped into the private elevator that led directly to his home. Surveillance footage showed him entering the elevator and a masked man dressed in all black stepping in right behind him. The man kept his head down and avoided the camera, following Saleh into the apartment immediately as the elevator doors opened. Moments after they entered, neighbors heard a short commotion, but not enough to raise alarms. The next day, when Saleh failed to respond to messages, a family member visited the apartment. That relative found his body inside the living room and immediately called police. Detectives arriving at the scene found a disturbing sight. Cleaning supplies were laid out. A vacuum cleaner was beside the body. Multiple contractor-style trash bags were prepared. Tools were present. It appeared the killer had intended to return to continue staging or removing evidence. The scene was partially cleaned, suggesting the plan was interrupted. But what stood out most to investigators was how controlled and organized everything looked. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a random intruder. This was someone who felt comfortable inside the apartment and confident moving around it. Detectives immediately pulled surveillance footage from the building. The masked figure's body language stood out. He moved calmly. He wasn't panicking or running. Combined with the private elevator access, investigators quickly concluded this had to be someone who either knew Saleh personally or had detailed knowledge of the building. The breakthrough came when investigators reviewed Saleh's financial records. Hours after Saleh died, his credit card was used at a nearby store to buy cleaning supplies and other tools. Surveillance footage from that store matched the same figure seen in the elevator. Payment records and store cameras directly linked those purchases to Tyrese Haspel. Detectives dug deeper and uncovered the earlier embezzlement. The stolen funds, the repayment plan, and the recent tension between Saleh and Haspel created a clear motive. Prosecutors argued Haspel feared his theft would eventually be exposed to authorities and decided to eliminate the one person who could hold him accountable. Investigators collected digital evidence, phone data, receipts, elevator footage, and physical evidence from the apartment. Everything pointed in the same direction. Within days, police arrested Haspel at an Airbnb he had rented. According to prosecutors, he still possessed the taser, believed to have been used during the attack. The legal process was long. Haspel was charged with second-degree murder and several related counts. Prosecutors presented a detailed timeline showing premeditation. They argued he planned the attack, purchased equipment, followed Saleh into his apartment, and attempted to cover up the crime before fleeing. Defense attorneys tried to argue diminished responsibility, but the evidence was overwhelming. In 2024, after the full legal proceedings concluded, Haspel was sentenced to 40 years to life in prison. The court emphasized the betrayal, noting how Saleh had chosen compassion and forgiveness instead of prosecution, only to be harmed by the very person he had tried to help. The case shook the tech world. Saleh's companies employed hundreds of people. Many saw him as a rising star, someone on the path to becoming a major global entrepreneur. His death highlighted how quickly trust can be exploited when someone with access makes a destructive decision. It also raised discussions about internal fraud, employee oversight, and the hidden risks of giving a single person too much control over finances and personal information. Today, friends and colleagues still describe Saleh as someone with enormous potential, whose life was cut short not by a stranger, but by someone within his own circle. The luxury apartment where the crime occurred rarely acknowledges the event publicly. For many, the case remains a reminder of a tragic truth. Sometimes the greatest danger doesn't come from outside. It comes from the people we least expect. Number 2. Amy Bishop. In February 2010, faculty members at the University of Alabama in Huntsville gathered inside a small conference room for what they expected to be a routine biology department meeting. These were researchers, professors, academics, people who dedicated their careers to science, teaching, and quiet work. Nothing about this meeting seemed unusual, but within minutes, that ordinary gathering would become one of the most shocking academic tragedies in modern American history. A respected professor, long considered, brilliant and accomplished, suddenly pulled out a handgun and opened fire on her colleagues, the people who sat beside her at seminars, the people she greeted in hallways, the people she worked with every day. What followed exposed years of hidden turmoil, past incidents no one fully understood, and a warning that had been overlooked long before the shooting ever happened. Amy Bishop had built a strong academic reputation. She held a Harvard PhD, conducted research in developmental biology, and eventually became a professor at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, a respected science institution. On paper, her career looked impressive, but underneath that success, coworkers later said she was unpredictable, argumentative, and fragile when faced with criticism. At the time of the shooting, she had recently been denied tenure, a decision that effectively ended her long-term academic career. Tenure denial is devastating in the academic world. It can mean the loss of research, position, and professional identity. For Bishop, colleagues later recalled, the denial appeared to push her into a volatile emotional state. There were also older incidents in her past that only gained attention after the shooting. In 1986, when Bishop was 21, she shot and killed her younger brother in their family home in Massachusetts. The incident was ruled accidental at the time, but investigators later questioned whether the case had been handled correctly. She was never charged. Years later, she also had a dispute at a restaurant where she punched a woman during an argument. These events painted a picture of someone who had a long history of conflict and instability, but none of these warnings seemed urgent until her career began collapsing. On the 12th of February 2010, the biology faculty meeting began just after midday. Bishop sat around the conference table with 12 other colleagues. Nothing seemed unusual. There were no raised voices, no signs of confrontation. Then, without speaking, she stood up, pulled out a handgun, and began firing at the people seated closest to her. 3 professors were killed almost instantly. 3 others were wounded. Witnesses later said she showed no emotion. She simply walked to the door, tried to leave, and found it locked. For a moment she appeared confused, then calmly walked toward a bathroom, put down the gun, and tried to blend in with others fleeing the building. When police arrived, they quickly detained her. She did not resist and did not deny what she had done. Officers later said she seemed almost detached, as if she were processing events in slow motion rather than reacting with fear or panic. Within hours, the campus was locked down, and national media reported one of the deadliest university shootings since Virginia Tech. As detectives pieced together the timeline, they found no evidence this was a spontaneous outburst. She had purchased the handgun years earlier. She had expressed anger about her tenure denial. Colleagues had noticed her frustration increasing in the months leading up to the meeting. Investigators reviewed her background and discovered the unresolved questions surrounding her brother's death. They also learned the restaurant assault case had been dismissed under unusual circumstances. Many began asking the same question: how did someone with such a long pattern of concerning behavior remain in highly pressured academic environments without intervention? The legal process moved methodically. Amy Bishop was charged with capital murder and attempted murder. Her defense team tried to argue mental illness and diminished responsibility. Prosecutors, however, presented a clear picture. They argued she planned the attack, targeted colleagues who had evaluated her, and chose a meeting where every key faculty member was in the same room. They pointed to her calm behavior after the shooting as a sign of awareness, not confusion. In September 2012, Bishop pleaded guilty to avoid the death penalty. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. During sentencing, family members of the victims described how the shooting destroyed departments, careers, families, and a sense of safety on campus. The aftermath reshaped campus safety protocols across the country. Universities began reevaluating the handling of tenure disputes, mental health warning signs, and how to treat internal complaints about erratic behavior. The academic world often prides itself on open dialogue, intellectual pressure, and independence, but the shooting exposed a blind spot. High achievement can sometimes hide deep instability. Colleagues later said that small warning signs were dismissed for years because people assumed a Harvard-trained scientist must be in control, even when she clearly was not. Today, the University of Alabama in Huntsville still carries the weight of what happened that day. Annual memorials honor the victims. The conference room where the shooting occurred was remodeled. Former colleagues recall that the tragedy did not just end the lives of brilliant professors. It shattered the illusion that academia is insulated from workplace violence. The case remains a powerful example of how stress, rejection, and untreated personal issues can collide with catastrophic consequences. And it stands as a reminder that red flags only matter if someone is willing to act on them before it is too late. Number 3. Jennifer San Marco. On the 30th of January 2006, a quiet neighborhood in Santa Barbara County suddenly became the opening chapter of one of the deadliest workplace attacks in California history. It began with a single unexpected gunshot inside a condominium complex, the kind of sound neighbors hesitated to report because it seemed too out of place. But hours later, that isolated noise would connect to a far larger tragedy unfolding at a United States Postal Service processing plant in Goleta. What investigators uncovered was a violent spree, carried out by a former postal employee, a woman whose deteriorating mental state had gone unnoticed for years. Her actions would expose flaws in workplace oversight, gaps in mental health intervention, and the disturbing ease with which warning signs can be ignored until it is far too late. Jennifer San Marco was once a postal employee at the Goleta Mail Processing and Distribution Center, a massive facility responsible for handling the region's mail. She worked there in the early 2000s, but was eventually placed on medical leave after her coworkers reported increasingly erratic behavior. Some described her as paranoid and convinced that people were conspiring against her. Others said she talked to herself, made bizarre claims, and sometimes interacted with people aggressively. Several coworkers reported concerns to supervisors, but she eventually left the job and moved to a small town in New Mexico. Her departure from the Postal Service marked the beginning of a long period of isolation. In New Mexico, her behavior continued troubling residents. She made unusual complaints, believed she was being followed, and repeatedly insisted that people were targeting her. Despite the concerning signs, she lived without sustained mental health treatment or monitoring. On January 30, she returned to California. That evening, before reaching the postal facility, she arrived at the home of her former neighbor, a 62-year-old woman named Beverly Graham. Investigators later determined that Graham had no known conflict with San Marco. She was simply the first person targeted. San Marco shot her and left the residence. To this day, the motive for this first killing remains unclear. Some investigators believe San Marco blamed Graham for imagined conspiracies. Others think Graham was targeted only because she happened to be an easily accessible figure from San Marco's past. After leaving the neighborhood, San Marco drove directly to the Goleta postal facility where she claims Trask had once worked. She approached the employee entrance but no longer had legitimate access. Investigators later discovered she used a stolen employee ID badge to get inside the building. Security at the time did not require PIN codes or multiple steps for verification. Once through the doors, she walked calmly into the massive sorting area where dozens of postal workers were preparing mail for distribution. Without speaking, she opened fire. She shot and killed 6 employees, including supervisors and sorting staff, many of whom recognized her from years earlier. Some victims were found near their workstations, others near exits, suggesting they had little time to react. The entire attack unfolded in minutes. As first responders raced to the scene, San Marco moved through the building, eventually stepping into a separate mailroom area away from the main floor. There, she ended the spree by taking her own life. When deputies entered the facility, they found 7 victims in total, including the earlier neighbor. The postal plant, normally filled with loud machinery and constant motion, had fallen into complete silence. Investigators began reconstructing her timeline. They found writings and notes that reflected severe paranoia. She believed coworkers had plotted against her years earlier. She believed the Postal Service was monitoring her. She believed she was the target of a coordinated campaign. None of these claims had any basis in reality, but the delusions were clear. The more detectives learned, the more they realized how long-lasting her deterioration had been. Coworkers from years earlier reported numerous warning signs, including shouting, incoherent conversations, and sudden emotional outbursts. She had been removed from the workplace for psychological evaluation, but was never placed into long-term treatment. After leaving California, she lived essentially unmonitored, drifting through small towns while her mental condition worsened. The absence of a trial meant the legal analysis relied entirely on investigative findings. Law enforcement concluded the motive was rooted entirely in severe mental illness. There was no evidence of organized planning beyond basic preparation. She brought a lawfully purchased firearm, used a stolen ID to enter the facility, and targeted people she believed were part of an imagined conspiracy. There was no manifesto, no clear list of targets, and no political or ideological motive. It was a delusional collapse that turned deadly because the systems designed to protect employees failed to intervene early enough. The aftermath was immediate and far-reaching. The United States Postal Service reviewed its security procedures nationwide. Facilities updated badge access requirements, added surveillance, and strengthened protocols for monitoring employees with documented behavioral issues. The attack also reignited the national discussion around workplace violence and the stereotype of the phrase "going postal," a term that originated from a string of postal-related shootings in the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds. Goleta became one of the deadliest in that history. Mental health advocates pointed to the case as a textbook example of untreated psychosis leading to tragedy. San Marco had displayed years of visible warning signs, each one concerning but never addressed in a coordinated way. Coworkers, neighbors, and residents in multiple states had noticed her decline. Yet, without consistent treatment or oversight, her paranoia deepened until it produced catastrophic consequences. Today, the Goleta facility operates with increased security and memorials for the 6 workers who lost their lives that night. The attack remains one of the rare instances of a female perpetrator carrying out a mass workplace killing, a demographic outlier that highlights just how extreme her mental state had become. For investigators and survivors, the case is still remembered as a tragedy that might have been preventable if earlier warnings had triggered stronger action. It stands as a reminder that ignoring escalating behavior, especially in a workplace setting, can have devastating outcomes. The victims were ordinary employees finishing their evening shifts. Their deaths illustrated how quickly a single, unresolved crisis can ripple outward and destroy lives in seconds. Number 4. Andrew Engeldinger. On the 27th of September 2012, employees at Accent Signage Systems in Minneapolis gathered for what should have been an ordinary workday. The small manufacturing company was known for producing tactile and braille signage used across the country. It was a calm environment, a place where most employees knew each other by name. But that afternoon, the building would become the site of the deadliest workplace shooting in Minnesota history. A former employee, recently terminated, walked through the doors with a handgun and unleashed a burst of violence that left 6 people dead and others injured. What investigators later discovered was a pattern of isolation, untreated mental health issues, and a termination meeting that tragically set everything in motion. Andrew John Engeldinger had worked at Accent Signage for roughly 12 years. Coworkers described him as quiet, introverted, and increasingly withdrawn over the years. His supervisors reported that he avoided interactions, kept to himself, and often seemed tense. Although he rarely made overt threats, several employees later recalled subtle signs that he was struggling. He had recently been written up for performance issues. His behavior had worsened in the months leading up to the shooting. Management had debated whether he was capable of handling his responsibilities, and eventually the decision was made to let him go. On the afternoon of September 27, Engeldinger was called into a termination meeting. Present were the company's founder, the operations director, and the human resources supervisor. What happened next unfolded in seconds. The meeting became tense as they informed him of his dismissal. Engeldinger reached into his bag, pulled out a handgun he had brought to the workplace, and shot 2 of the supervisors at close range. The attack was so sudden that no one in the room had time to react. One supervisor died instantly. The company founder, who had built Accent Signage from the ground up, was fatally wounded. After the first shots, Engeldinger left the small conference area and moved through the building. Multiple employees attempted to escape through hallways, offices, and exits. Several were shot as he walked through the plant. Orderly workspaces turned chaotic as people hid under desks, ran to loading docks, and tried to reach the street outside. The entire attack lasted only a few minutes, but by the time Engeldinger reached the loading dock area, 5 employees had already been killed and others wounded. As law enforcement arrived, they secured the building and ushered survivors out through safe exits. Officers found Engeldinger near the back of the facility. He had taken his own life. A search of his belongings revealed he had been carrying hundreds of rounds of ammunition. Investigators later found evidence that he had purchased thousands of rounds in the months before the shooting, suggesting he had been preparing for an act of violence long before the termination meeting. When detectives reconstructed his history, they found troubling indicators. Engeldinger had been showing signs of severe isolation. Coworkers described him as someone who avoided conversation, refused assistance, and showed visible frustration at small workplace corrections. His family later released a statement acknowledging he had struggled with untreated mental illness, particularly paranoia, but had refused help. They said they had tried to intervene over the years, but he distanced himself from relatives and coworkers. He lived alone, rarely socialized, and spent most of his private time in isolation. Investigators determined the shooting was not spontaneous, despite occurring immediately after the termination meeting. The presence of the handgun, the additional ammunition, and purchases made ahead of time indicated preparation. Authorities concluded he had brought the weapon expecting conflict, even if the exact moment of the attack occurred in response to being fired. The company had no reason to believe he was armed. At the time, workplace security procedures in small private businesses rarely anticipated this type of threat. The legal process was limited because Engeldinger died at the scene. There was no trial, no testimony, and no opportunity for cross-examination. Instead, the legal focus shifted to workplace safety and liability. Families of the victims filed civil lawsuits questioning the way the termination was handled. They argued that the company did not have proper safety protocols in place for firing employees with documented behavioral problems. The lawsuits did not accuse the company of causing the violence, but highlighted the need for structured risk assessments when dealing with employees showing noticeable signs of instability. The aftermath reshaped Minnesota's conversation around workplace safety. Mental health experts emphasized the importance of early intervention. Companies began reviewing termination procedures, adding security planning, and learning how to identify high-risk situations. Law enforcement agencies used the case in training sessions to illustrate how workplace violence can erupt suddenly from a combination of long-term stress, social isolation, and employment instability. Former Accent Signage employees later spoke about the sense of shock that followed the attack. Many had worked with Engeldinger for years. They said he rarely raised his voice or behaved aggressively. The shooting didn't match the image they had of him. That contrast made the tragedy harder to understand. The victims were respected employees, supervisors, and workers doing their jobs on a regular Thursday afternoon. The suddenness of the violence left deep emotional scars across the small business community. Today, the building where Accent Signage operated has been renovated, and new companies occupy parts of the property. But the events of that day remain part of Minnesota history, a reminder that workplace violence can emerge without dramatic warnings. The case stands as one of the clearest examples of how unaddressed mental health struggles, combined with sudden job loss and easy access to a firearm, can lead to catastrophic consequences. The lives lost that day highlight the urgent need for safety protocols, mental health support, and proactive intervention before a crisis reaches a breaking point. Number 5. Gary Martin. On the 15th of February 2019, inside a manufacturing warehouse in Aurora, Illinois, a termination meeting that should have lasted only a few minutes turned into one of the deadliest workplace attacks the state had ever seen. 5 employees were killed, including managers and longtime coworkers, and several police officers were wounded in the gunfire that followed. What made the tragedy even more disturbing was what investigators learned afterward. The shooter should never have legally owned a firearm. His violent history had been documented, his criminal background was clear, and yet the system that was supposed to prevent him from having a weapon failed at every level. Gary Montez Martin had worked at the Henry Pratt Company, a manufacturing plant specializing in industrial valves, for about 15 years. Coworkers described him as someone who kept to himself. Some said he was polite but distant. Others felt he was unpredictable, with a temper that surfaced during confrontations. His relationship with management had become strained. In the months leading up to the attack, Martin had been disciplined several times for performance issues and behavior problems. He was eventually scheduled for termination. Unbeknownst to his coworkers, Martin had a long history of violence. Court records from Mississippi revealed a felony aggravated assault conviction dating back to the 1992, along with reports of domestic violence. Because of that felony conviction, he was legally prohibited from owning a firearm, but when he applied for a firearm owner's ID card in Illinois, it was mistakenly approved because his Mississippi records did not appear in the initial background check. Later, when he attempted to purchase a handgun, the deeper background review flagged the felony conviction. His gun permit should have been revoked, and the weapon surrendered. Instead, no one followed up. Martin kept the handgun illegally for years, without law enforcement taking action. That failure would become central to understanding what happened inside the plant. On the day of the shooting, Martin arrived at work knowing he was about to be fired. He had the handgun with him. He entered the DASIS, small conference room, where his termination meeting was already underway. As managers and human resources staff informed him of the company's decision, he immediately pulled out the weapon and opened fire on the people sitting closest to him. 3 were killed almost instantly. Others attempted to flee the room. Martin then left the meeting area and moved through the warehouse, firing at additional employees who crossed his path. Workers described the scene as chaotic. Some hid inside offices and storage rooms. Others escaped through side doors and loading docks. Many said they had no idea what was happening until they saw coworkers running. Aurora police responded within minutes. As officers entered the building, Martin ambushed them from inside, wounding several with the same handgun that should have been confiscated years earlier. The gun battle lasted for over an hour as Martin moved through the large industrial facility. Officers eventually located him near the back of the problem warehouse. He was killed during the final exchange of gunfire. Once investigators secured the building, they began reconstructing Martin's timeline. They discovered he had made threats at work in the past. He had told coworkers he would retaliate if he ever lost his job. Many employees had dismissed the comments as anger or frustration, not realizing how serious they were. What shocked the public even more was the background check failure that allowed him to keep a firearm. The Illinois State Police admitted that while Martin's firearm purchase had been denied years earlier, the follow-up process to retrieve the gun had never been completed. His revoked approval simply sat in a file while he continued to carry the weapon freely. The legal process shifted from criminal prosecution to investigative reviews and civil action. Because Martin died at the scene, there was no trial. Instead, families of the victims pursued legal claims against his estate. A judge later awarded $60 million in civil judgments to the families. The ruling was mostly symbolic, but it formally recognized the severity of the harm caused. Public officials, lawmakers, and state police agencies all faced intense criticism for the system failures that allowed the tragedy to occur. The aftermath triggered reforms in Illinois firearm enforcement. The state implemented stricter protocols for retrieving guns from individuals whose permits were revoked. Additional steps were added to ensure background check failures were escalated rather than ignored. The attack also sparked national conversation around workplace violence and termination procedures. Many companies began revising protocols for firing employees, including adding security presence during termination meetings, training managers to identify risks, and establishing clearer warning systems for concerning behavior. For the employees of Henry Pratt Company, the shock was profound. They had walked into a typical Friday shift, expecting nothing more than another day at the plant. Instead, they witnessed colleagues and friends killed in the very place they worked every day. Survivors later described months of fear returning to the building. Some said they could not enter the facility again. Others struggled with the trauma of hearing gunfire and seeing coworkers wounded. The company held memorials for the victims, and the community rallied around the families affected. Today, the Aurora workplace shooting stands as one of the clearest examples of how a breakdown in background check enforcement can lead directly to tragedy. It also shows how termination meetings, especially when involving volatile or previously violent employees, require careful planning. Martin concealed deep anger, long-standing personal issues, and a violent criminal history that had gone unaddressed. His attack revealed a chain of failures, from the moment the gun was improperly approved to the moment he walked into the meeting armed. The victims that day were ordinary employees carrying out routine duties. The tragedy served as a reminder that a single, unchecked threat can unravel an entire workplace in minutes. Number 6. Jinghua Wu. On the 14th of November, 2008, inside a Silicon Valley office park in Santa Clara, Three high-ranking executives at a small tech company sat down for what they believed would be a tense but routine meeting. The firm had recently downsized, the economy was unstable, and layoffs were happening across the tech industry. Nothing suggested that this meeting would become one of the most shocking workplace killings in Silicon Valley history. Minutes after the discussion began, the man they had laid off just weeks earlier walked into the room with a handgun. What happened next exposed the hidden pressures inside tech companies, the emotional fallout of sudden layoffs, and the rare but devastating impact of workplace violence within an industry known more for innovation than tragedy. Jinghua Wu was a trusted employee at Seaport Incorporated, a small semiconductor startup developing chips for portable devices. Wu was a highly educated engineer, well respected for his technical skill. Supervisors described him as hardworking, quiet, and detail-driven. But he was also under immense pressure. Seaport had been struggling financially during the 2008 downturn. Investors were nervous, contracts were uncertain, and management made the decision to cut staff. Wu was one of the employees let go. According to coworkers, the news hit him hard. He had a family to support, bills to pay, and a visa status tied to employment. His performance reviews had always been strong, and he felt blindsided by the sudden dismissal. After the layoff, Wu became increasingly distressed. Investigators learned that he repeatedly told friends he felt his career had been unfairly destroyed. He believed the company executives had wronged him personally. He had no prior criminal record, no identified history of violence, and no documented mental health diagnosis. But the combination of financial pressure, career uncertainty, and the emotional shock of the layoff created a dangerous internal spiral. In the weeks leading up to the shooting, prosecutors later argued, Wu fixated on the idea that the people responsible for firing him needed to be confronted. On the afternoon of November 14, Wu entered the Seaport office. He was familiar with the layout, the employees, and the meeting schedule. He carried a handgun he had purchased legally. In a conference room, the company's CEO, the head of human resources, and the vice president of operations were preparing for a routine discussion. Wu walked in without warning and opened fire. All three were killed instantly. The attack lasted less than a minute. Employees in nearby offices reported hearing a series of loud cracks, followed by silence. At first, some thought a piece of equipment had malfunctioned. Others believed it was construction noise from a nearby suite. But when people stepped into the hallway, they found coworkers running for cover and realized something far worse had happened. After the shooting, Wu fled the building. Police launched a rapid manhunt across Santa Clara and the surrounding cities. The search lasted several hours. Officers tracked him through phone records, movement patterns, and tips from the community. Wu was eventually arrested without resistance later that same evening. According to officers, he appeared calm and cooperative. The contrast between his demeanor and the violent act he had just committed only deepened the sense of confusion among investigators. As detectives pieced together the evidence, the motive became clearer. Wu had been deeply affected by the layoff and believed the executives had ruined his career prospects. Prosecutors emphasized that the attack was planned. He had chosen a moment when all three targets were in the same room. He brought the weapon into the building knowingly. He walked directly to the meeting without hesitation. They argued that his actions showed intent, not impulse. The legal process that followed lasted nearly 5 years. Wu was charged with multiple counts of first-degree murder. His defense team attempted to argue that he was under extreme emotional distress due to job loss and financial pressure, but the court rejected any claim of diminished responsibility. The killings were too precise, too direct, and too intentional. In March 2013, after a full trial, Wu was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder with enhancements. In August 2013, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus additional years for firearm charges. The case gained wide attention in Silicon Valley because workplace shootings in the tech industry are rare. Startups often face pressure, layoffs, and intense workloads, but they rarely experience violent retaliation. Tech workers across the region were shaken by the idea that a fired engineer could return and target executives. The attack prompted discussions within the industry about layoff procedures, employee mental health, and safety protocols. Companies began reviewing how they deliver termination notices, how they support displaced employees, and whether additional security precautions were needed during periods of economic downturn. For Cyport, the tragedy was devastating. The company lost its top leadership in a single afternoon. Within months, the firm collapsed. Investors withdrew, projects stalled, and the startup never recovered. Employees described the aftermath as surreal. A company built around innovation and engineering had been destroyed not by competition, but by violence from within. Today, the Santa Clara office park, where the shooting occurred, houses different companies. The Seaport name has disappeared from the tech landscape, remembered mostly in the context of the tragedy. But the case remains a powerful reminder that workplace violence can emerge even in industries that seem insulated by wealth, education, and professional ambition. Layoffs can trigger intense emotional reactions, especially when combined with financial pressure or perceived injustice. The Seaport shooting demonstrated how quickly a single event can shatter a workplace and change the trajectory of an entire company. The victims that day were professionals dedicated to building a future in technology. They were parents, innovators, and leaders. Their deaths exposed the fragile human side of the tech world, an industry that often prioritizes results over well-being. For Silicon Valley, the tragedy served as a warning. Even in the world's most advanced tech hubs, the pressures facing employees can become overwhelming. And when people fall through the cracks, the consequences can be devastating. Number 7. Gabriel DeWitt Wilson. On the 20th of April 2021, workers at a Stop & Shop supermarket in West Hempstead, Long Island, began their morning routine like any other. Employees stocked shelves, managers prepared schedules, and customers slowly filtered in for their early grocery runs. It was the quiet, predictable environment of a large retail store. But before noon, that calm turned into panic when a former employee walked into the second-floor management offices with a handgun. Within seconds, he shot the store manager and wounded 2 others before fleeing the building. The manhunt that followed shut down entire neighborhoods. The shooting exposed the growing tensions inside retail workplaces and raised questions about how warning signs from former employees can go unnoticed until it is too late. Gabriel DeWitt Wilson had worked at the Stop & Shop as a cart collector and maintenance employee. Coworkers described him as someone who occasionally got into arguments, especially with supervisors. Some said he felt disrespected by management. Others said he often believed rules were enforced against him more harshly than against others. He had been disciplined several times, and eventually his employment was terminated. According to investigators, Wilson believed he had been treated unfairly. Over time, that resentment grew. Prior to the shooting, Wilson had displayed concerning behavior. There were reports of conflicts with coworkers, complaints about perceived mistreatment, and accusations that supervisors had singled him out. But none of the incidents were seen as violent or threatening enough to involve law enforcement. After he was let go, Wilson largely disappeared from the store's orbit. There was no indication he was planning anything. But detectives later concluded that the frustration he carried did not fade. Instead, it intensified until the day he returned to confront the people he held responsible. On the morning of April 20, Wilson entered the Stop & Shop building through a back or employee access area. He moved past customers and made his way to the second-floor offices where the store's management team worked. Witnesses later said he acted with purpose, not hesitation. Inside the office suite, the store manager, a 9-year-old man named Ray Wishrop, was eating lunch at his desk. Other supervisors were working nearby. Without warning, Wilson opened fire. Wishrop was killed instantly. 2 other employees were shot and wounded as they attempted to flee or take cover. The attack was over in seconds, but the shock rippled through the store immediately as employees and customers began running toward exits. police received multiple 911 calls within moments. Responders evacuated the supermarket and set up a perimeter. A large manhunt began as investigators confirmed Wilson had fled the building on foot. The search expanded across West Hempstead, involving local police, county officers, and state units. Schools were placed on lockdown. Businesses closed their doors. Helicopters circled the area, while officers went door to door. The situation forced thousands of residents to shelter indoors. While authorities tracked Wilson's movements through witness reports and surveillance footage, hours later, investigators found him hiding inside a first-floor apartment building in Hempstead, only a short distance from the supermarket. Officers entered the building and located Wilson in a hallway. He was arrested without gunfire. According to police, he did not resist and appeared calm. The contrast between the violent attack at the store and his quiet demeanor during arrest left investigators questioning what mental state he had been in during the shooting. Detectives interviewed coworkers and supervisors to understand Wilson's motives. They learned that he had clashed repeatedly with management and believed he had been treated unfairly. Employees reported he blamed supervisors for disciplinary actions and felt targeted when rules were enforced. Prosecutors argued the shooting was intentional, planned, and motivated by resentment toward specific individuals. They emphasized that Wilson did not attack random customers and did not fire indiscriminately across the store. Instead, he went directly to the management offices and targeted the people he believed had wronged him. That precision, prosecutors said, demonstrated intent rather than emotional loss of control. The legal process moved quickly. Wilson was charged with second-degree murder, attempted murder, assault, and multiple weapons offenses. During the trial, prosecutors presented surveillance footage, witness testimony, ballistic evidence, and statements showing Wilson knew exactly where management would be during the late morning hours. Defense attorneys attempted to argue mental health issues, claiming Wilson struggled with delusions and paranoia. But the jury found the evidence of premeditation overwhelming. In 2023, Wilson was convicted on all major charges. He was later sentenced to 50 years to life in prison. The sentence reflected the severity of the attack, the loss of a respected manager, and the lasting trauma left on the employees who witnessed the shooting. Many store workers said they struggled for months to return to a sense of normalcy. Some left retail work entirely. Others suffered anxiety and fear while being inside the building again. The aftermath prompted Stop & Shop and other retail chains across the country to reevaluate their security protocols. Many expanded training for conflict de-escalation, implemented new procedures for dealing with former employees, and reviewed access points to private areas inside stores. Retail environments are often high-pressure settings with customer demands, staff shortages, and management disputes. But this case exposed how quickly a grievance between an employee and supervisor can escalate when resentment builds unchecked. Today, the West Hempstead Stop & Shop continues to operate, but the memory of the shooting remains. Customers still remember the massive manhunt that unfolded in their neighborhood. Employees remember the sudden chaos, the calls to loved ones, and the fear that spread through every aisle. The tragedy showed that even in everyday workplaces like grocery stores, the threat of targeted violence is real. And it highlighted how critical it is to recognize and address escalating tension before a workplace disagreement becomes something far more dangerous. Number 8. Carrie Jo Tesney. On the morning of the 23rd of September 2014, employees at a UPS facility in Birmingham, Alabama, gathered for the start of another busy workday. Delivery drivers were lining up their trucks, supervisors were preparing the daily route schedules, and workers were moving through the building to clock in. It was a typical morning inside one of the largest package distribution networks in the country. But just after 9 a.m., the normal rhythm of the facility collapsed when a longtime UPS driver walked into the building wearing his brown company uniform. Within seconds, he shot 2 supervisors and ended his own, to life. The attack shocked the company, stunned the city, and forced investigators to examine how a veteran employee's quiet grievances grew into a deadly workplace tragedy. Carrie Jo Tesney was 45 years old and had spent more than 2 decades as a UPS delivery driver. He was known for being reliable, consistent, and familiar with nearly every major route in the region. Coworkers said he was generally calm and kept to himself. He was not the type of employee people expected to see in conflict. But beneath that quiet exterior, investigators later learned Tesny had been struggling. He had recently been fired after a long disciplinary process. He had also been appealing the decision, hoping it would be reversed. When UPS denied the appeal, he lost both his job and the stability he had built over 20 years. Termination in a high-pressure logistics company can carry significant emotional weight. For drivers, the job becomes a routine, almost an identity. Losing it can feel like losing a part of their life. Detectives found that Tesny took the decision personally. He felt he had been treated unfairly and believed some supervisors were responsible for ending his career. Most employees move on after a termination, even if reluctantly. But for Tesny, the stress built into something darker. On the morning of the shooting, Tesny parked near the UPS facility and approached the building wearing his uniform. At first, no one questioned his presence. Employees assumed he was attending a meeting or sorting out paperwork related to his appeal. He walked through the loading area and entered the main office section of the building, where supervisors typically handled schedules and performance reports. He moved with purpose and did not attempt to hide his identity. When he reached the small office area where management worked, he pulled out a handgun. Inside the room were 2 supervisors who had been involved in either his disciplinary actions or his termination. Without speaking, Tesny opened fire. Both men were killed before they had time to react. A third employee, who heard the shots, fled down a hallway and warned others to escape. The building erupted into chaos as workers ran toward exits and called 911. Many employees said later that they initially thought something had fallen or a truck had echoed against the dock doors. Only when they saw people running did they realize it was gunfire. Police arrived within minutes. Officers entered the facility and moved through the building, locating employees, hiding behind boxes and inside delivery trucks. In a small office area near the back of the facility, they found Tesny deceased from a self-inflicted gunshot. The attack was over almost as quickly as it had begun, but the emotional impact lingered long after the gunfire stopped. Investigators pieced together the motive. They discovered Tesny had received his final appeal denial shortly before the shooting. The appeal was his last chance to return to the job he had held for more than half his life. Phone records, computer searches, and statements from friends suggested he had been extremely distressed about his firing. But there were no direct threats, no warnings given to police, and no clear sign that he planned to return violently. His decision to come to the facility in uniform, however, demonstrated that he intended to blend in and reach the supervisors without suspicion. The legal process centered entirely on reconstructing the event, because Tesny's death meant there would be no criminal trial. The case shifted toward understanding systemic issues around workplace terminations. UPS cooperated with investigators and conducted its own internal review. The company faced heavy criticism from some workers and labor advocates who argued that UPS did not take employee mental health seriously enough, especially in high-stress positions. Some questioned whether the termination process should include security measures, particularly when an employee has shown signs of distress or has a long career suddenly ending. Survivors described the lasting trauma of the event. Many said they struggled to return to the building afterward. Others requested transfers or took extended leave. UPS brought in counselors to support employees, but the shock remained. The 2 supervisors who died had long careers, families, and were respected by their teams. Their deaths left deep wounds across the Birmingham facility. The aftermath sparked broader discussion about workplace violence in America. Experts emphasized that terminations can be high-risk moments, especially when combined with financial strain, perceived injustice, and lack of social support. Companies across the logistics and retail industries revisited their safety procedures for firing employees. Some added security personnel during high-risk meetings. Others introduced mandatory mental health check-ins for employees experiencing disciplinary actions. Today, the UPS facility continues to operate, but the scars of the 2014 shooting remain part of its history. The incident stands as a reminder that even in well-structured corporate environments, personal struggles can spiral into tragedy when left unaddressed. Tesny's coworkers remembered him as a quiet man who rarely displayed anger. That calm exterior masked frustration and despair that no one fully understood. The shooting demonstrated how unpredictable workplace violence can be and how important it is to take emotional warning signs seriously before they escalate. Number 9. Jeremy Spicer. On the 22nd of March 2022, a quiet office park in Burr Ridge, Illinois became the center of a rapidly unfolding workplace tragedy that spanned multiple businesses and left employees across the complex running for their lives. What began as a single shooting inside a freight management company quickly expanded into a multi-location attack as the gunman moved from one employer to another, targeting people connected to his work history. By the end of the spree, one man was dead, another was wounded, and the suspect had taken his own life. Investigators later said it was one of the most unusual workplace violence cases the region had ever seen because the attacker moved with a level of purpose rarely seen in these situations. He had not chosen random victims. He had chosen people tied to specific grievances. 31-year-old Jeremy Spicer worked as a truck driver for a small transportation company located inside the Burr Ridge office complex. Coworkers described him as someone who felt easily wronged and often believed others were blaming him for mistakes. According to people who interacted with him, Spicer had argued with several supervisors over performance issues. He also had a history of moving between employers within the same office park. That meant multiple businesses knew him, had worked with him, or had parted ways with him under strained circumstances. To most people, these were minor workplace disagreements, but investigators later concluded Spicer viewed them as serious personal attacks. On the morning of March 22, Spicer walked into Winners Freight, the company where he worked most recently. Inside, the business owner and several employees were preparing documents for the day's deliveries. Spicer entered the office without raising suspicion. He approached his supervisor, confronted him, and within seconds fired a handgun, killing him. Nearby employees attempted to run or hide, escaping through side hallways. Spicer then left the building as calmly as he had entered. Most workplace shootings end in a single building. But Spicer then did something that caught investigators off guard. Instead of fleeing the area, he walked across the same office park to another business where he had previously been employed. This second company, located only a short distance away, had reportedly parted ways with him under negative circumstances. Inside the lobby, a receptionist and several staff members were working. Spicer entered the building and opened fire again, seriously wounding a female receptionist before leaving the scene. Detectives later said this movement between buildings demonstrated clear intent. He was not acting impulsively. He was moving through a list. Employees across the office park began calling 911. Some reported hearing multiple bursts of gunfire. Others saw Spicer moving between businesses with the weapon in hand. Police from Burr Ridge and surrounding departments rushed to the complex. As they began evacuating buildings, officers realized the suspect had fled on foot toward the rear of the property. A multi-agency search was launched, with officers fanning out across the surrounding area. About an hour later, officers located Spicer near a wooded portion of the complex. When they approached, they found that he had already taken his own life. The scene was secured, and investigators began the process of reconstructing the spree from the first confrontation to his final moments. Detectives interviewed former coworkers, supervisors, and employees in multiple businesses. They found that Spicer had recently been facing possible termination or disciplinary action at Winners Freight. He believed his supervisor was unfairly targeting him, and he told others he felt disrespected at work. His employment history within the complex showed a pattern of short stints, friction with management, and a growing sense of resentment. What made the case stand out was his choice to attack two businesses where he had professional disputes rather than acting at a single location. The legal process did not include a trial due to Spicer's death, but investigators presented the findings to the public in a detailed briefing. They concluded that the motive was directly tied to workplace conflicts and a belief that he had been wronged by multiple employers. They emphasized that the attack was not random. The victims were targeted specifically because of their roles in his employment history. Detectives also noted that Spicer did not attempt to harm customers or unrelated employees. His focus remained entirely on staff connected to his grievances. The aftermath shook the Burr Ridge community. The office park, a place normally associated with logistics companies, real estate offices, and small businesses, had suddenly become the site of a multi-stage shooting. Employees described feeling unsafe returning to the complex. Many said they had never considered that a former coworker could walk into the building and attack multiple businesses in a single morning. Some companies installed new security systems. Others added locked entry doors, requiring buzz-in access where none existed before. Experts in workplace violence examined the case as an example of how grievances can escalate when they are mixed with personal instability and easy access to a firearm. They emphasized that employers must take warning signs seriously, especially when dealing with employees who become increasingly paranoid, confrontational, or resentful. While there were no explicit threats from Spicer before the shooting, investigators learned he had been under significant stress due to job instability and financial pressure. Combined with his history of workplace disagreements, those factors created a dangerous environment. Today, the Burr Ridge office complex has returned to normal operations, but the scars remain. Businesses affected by the shootings still remember the sound of gunfire and the chaos that followed. The families of the victims continue to cope with the sudden loss of coworkers, friends, and loved ones. The case remains a sobering reminder that workplace violence does not always occur within a single building or from a single moment of anger. Sometimes it unfolds across multiple locations, driven by grievances that build quietly over time until they erupt without warning. The tragedy showed how important it is for companies to recognize escalating tension before it reaches a breaking point, because once violence begins, it can spread far beyond the place where it started. Number 10. Afeni Badu Muhammad. On the morning of the 11th of July 2025, the McDonald's restaurant on 9 Mile Road in East Point, Michigan, opened like any other day. Employees prepared breakfast orders, customers lined up at the drive-thru, and the manager, Jennifer Harris, began her shift, as she had for more than 15 years. She was a mother of 6, known for her patience, fairness, and ability to keep a busy fast food restaurant running smoothly. But just after 8 a.m., that ordinary morning collapsed into a tragedy that stunned the community and quickly became national news. A disgruntled employee returned to the building armed with a knife. Within seconds, the routine of a fast food kitchen turned into a deadly confrontation that would raise questions about workplace tensions, employee mental health, and the increasing frequency of violence inside everyday businesses. Afeni Badu Muhammad was 27 years old and had worked at the East Point McDonald's for only a short period. Coworkers described her as quiet, intense, and often unpredictable. Some said she could be polite and hardworking. Others said she seemed volatile and became frustrated easily. On the morning of the incident, Muhammad got into a disagreement with her manager, Jennifer Harris. According to prosecutors, Harris instructed her to go home for the day after the argument. It was a decision managers make regularly in fast food environments. But for reasons investigators would later try to piece together, Muhammad took the decision as a personal insult and left the restaurant with growing anger. What happened next was confirmed by surveillance footage and witness statements. Instead of going home, Muhammad returned to the apartment building where she lived, retrieved a knife, and put on a black mask and black clothing. She then walked back to the same McDonald's she had just been dismissed from, but this time she did not enter through the front door. She used the employee entrance, a back access point normally meant for staff, deliveries, and scheduled workers. Surveillance video captured her entering the building quietly, moving with purpose, and heading straight toward the kitchen area where Harris was working. Inside the restaurant, Harris was preparing food and helping her team manage the morning rush. When Muhammad approached her, there was no argument, no escalation, and no warning. According to investigators, she attacked immediately, stabbing the manager multiple times. Employees nearby screamed and ran toward the front of the restaurant. Customers fled the lobby. Several workers called 911 as they escaped through drive-through windows and side doors. The attack lasted only seconds, but left Harris critically injured on the floor. What happened next turned the case into a nationwide headline. A customer who was legally armed was in the building at the time of the attack. When he saw Harris being stabbed, he drew his firearm and intervened. He fired at Muhammad, striking her and stopping the assault. His actions ended the attack before more people were harmed. Harris was rushed to the hospital but did not survive her injuries. Muhammad, despite being shot, survived and was taken into custody after receiving medical treatment. The armed customer cooperated fully with authorities and was not charged, with investigators stating his actions were justified in defense of life. As detectives began their work, they reconstructed Muhammad's timeline and motives. They confirmed the argument with Harris earlier that morning. They found that Muhammad had been sent home for behavior issues before, but not to the point of termination. There were no prior violent incidents in her employment record. Investigators determined the attack was targeted. Muhammad went directly to raid Harris and did not attempt to harm any other employees or customers. The decision to put on a mask, re-enter through the staff entrance, and bring a weapon pointed to premeditation. The legal process moved quickly, due to the severity of the crime. Muhammad was charged with first-degree premeditated murder, carrying a dangerous weapon with unlawful intent, and other related offenses. Prosecutors argued she planned the attack from the moment she left the restaurant the first time. They emphasized the sequence of events: retrieving a weapon, disguising herself, re-entering through the employee-only door, and targeting Harris specifically. Her defense sought a psychological evaluation, and in the weeks following her arrest, the court found her competent to stand trial. The case drew massive media attention because of the combination of workplace violence, a rapid police response, and the rare instance of an armed bystander intervening during an attack. For the employees of that McDonald's, the aftermath was devastating. Many had witnessed the attack from only a few feet away. Some had worked with Harris for years and saw her as the steady foundation of the store. The restaurant closed temporarily for trauma counseling and investigation. When it reopened, several employees chose not to return. Customers created a memorial outside the building, leaving flowers, candles, and handwritten messages for Harris's family. Her 6 children were left without their mother, and the community raised funds to support them. The case sparked national debate about workplace safety in fast food and retail environments. Managers across the country discussed the growing tension workers face from staffing shortages, customer conflicts, and emotional stress. Experts argued that frontline jobs, especially in fast food, combine low pay, long hours, and high pressure, creating a volatile environment where disputes can escalate quickly. Others pointed to the increasing frequency of attacks in everyday places like grocery stores, restaurants, and gas stations as a sign that society must better address mental health and conflict management before violence erupts. Today, the East Point McDonald's continues to operate, but the events of July 11 remain part of its identity. Jennifer Harris is remembered as a dedicated worker and mother who was respected by her team. The tragedy stands as a reminder that even ordinary workplaces are not immune to sudden violence. It shows how quickly a simple disagreement can spiral into a life-altering event when someone returns with a weapon and a decision already made. The case remains one of the most shocking examples of workplace violence in recent years, and continues to spark conversations about how to protect employees in the increasingly tense environments of everyday American jobs.